Welcome back everybody to another episode, and in today's episode it's no surprise, we're gonna be talking about frogging, and I got my frog box out here, so get ready and stay tuned. Alright guys, so like I said, we're talking about frogging, okay? My last few videos, been on the Mississippi River, been doing some frogging, and as you guys can see, it has been going well. Before we jump into this video, I may sound kind of nasally, whatever. I'm losing my voice a little bit here, but I got a little bit of a cold coming up here. Hopefully it doesn't get too bad because I have a two-day bass fishing tournament this weekend, so I gotta be ready to rock and roll for that. So, but like I said, we have been doing a ton of frogging out on the Mississippi River, so I figured, you know what, let's just dive into frogs here. Let's dive in, let's go through them, modifications that I make, anything like that, how I fish them, things I look for and stuff like that. First things first, I have my big frogging box. This thing is just stacked full of frogs here. So the first thing we're gonna talk about is color. Right, so color. So man, I've got so many different colored frogs, it's crazy. And a lot of these frogs here, I've never even used. Like I have this color of a frog here, bought it because it kind of looked cool, but I haven't used it at all. I'll pretty much, this frog's a little bit different too as well. I really like this chartreuse bottom, but I haven't used this one much as well either. But the main thing that I stick to when fishing a frog, guys, is usually on like cloudier days, I'll tend to lean towards a black frog, and the reason being is the fish only sees the bottom of these frogs. A lot of times you'll see the top of these frogs painted with fancy designs. The fish is only seeing the bottom of the frog. So on cloudy days, I like to use an all black frog because when that bass is looking up through that water, the black frog just silhouettes better in the water. And then for sunny days, I tend to lean more towards a white frog, an all white frog. These are all, like mainly all my frogs are Spro frogs. I just really, I'm not associated with the brand. I just really like Spro frogs, but I do fish a white one usually on sunnier days. Still silhouettes really nice in the water. My all-time favorite color here, it's like a rainforest color they call it from Spro. This is kind of like a white with chartreuse bottom here. This frog here, just for some reason, seems to be like the ticket all the time. I throw this frog like 98% of the time. Really like this this color of a frog. One of the differences you're gonna see in frogs is you have your normal standard frog, which just has like this pointier nose, and then you have your cupped up frog, which just has a cup at the it's a popping frog really. Now if I'm fishing a lot of lily pads, okay, a lot of lily pads that have good spaces in between them of open water, I'll switch to the popping frog because I want to create a little more commotion on top. And also when I'm in those spaces in between lily pads, I want to make sure that that fish is able to find where this frog is at. Another thing that I like this for is if I'm going down a bank that doesn't have a ton of cover, but you know, you're close to it, I'll throw this right down like the weed line of things and stuff like that. The popping frog just really works well in a little bit more open water situations. You can throw it in that thicker vegetation, but it is going to get, you know, vegetation is going to get caught up there. But the popping frog is always a great frog. I absolutely love using a popping frog, does really well, but you definitely want a little more open water for this one. Now this guy here, you could throw it in the thick of thick, guys. Last week on the Mississippi River, we were throwing it around, you know, in some pretty thick stuff, and this is gonna be the frog that's gonna get through a lot of that really thick stuff, no problem. So another thing, when I get a Spro frog fresh out of the package, now Spro has kind of changed up how they send their frogs now. You'll notice that like I have some Booyah frogs here, and really the biggest thing that you have to look for when they come out of the package is the legs that are coming off of the frog. Now you'll notice this Booyah here has ridiculously long legs on here. You're definitely gonna want to trim them up, and one of the ways that I do that for trimming up a frog is I flip it upside down, and I like to trim the frog even with how long it is. So you see how far down these legs hang? I like to trim it like right there. So I'm taking these off and the legs will be even with how long the body of the frog is. Now with the Spro frogs, they pretty much come long enough. Like they're not too long, but they're not too short. And the first thing that I like to do with these Spro frogs is I like to take and cut one of the legs shorter than the other. So typically when I pull this out of the box, out of the packaging, I will leave like this leg just as long as it is, and then I'll trim up this one. So this leg right here will actually be shorter than this leg here. And what that's gonna help you do by having one long leg and one short leg is it's gonna help you walk the dog with the frog through the water. A lot of people like to walk the dog, including myself actually, shortening up one of the legs and keeping the other one longer will help you just sit there and walk the dog through the water a lot better. Another little tip that guys do with frogs, guys, and I do it occasionally. I haven't done it a lot lately, but with Spro frogs, sometimes, once in a while, if I feel like my hookup ratio is just getting really tough, what I'll do is I'll grab a big pliers, and I'll bend the hooks up a little bit on the Spro frogs. I don't do it often. I think Spro frogs, fresh out of the package, are pretty much good to go. But sometimes I will bend up the hooks if I feel like I'm not getting a good hookup ratio. Right, so now when it comes to fishing a frog, I think the most important thing that we need to focus on here is looking for areas that we're gonna throw that frog in. Now, on the Mississippi River, and this is just kind of general for areas, you really want to find clumps of grass that are good ambush points. Now, a prime example, we were out on the Mississippi last weekend, had good flowing water coming through a slough, and there was duckweed kind of piling in certain spots, okay? It wasn't like the whole bank was duckweed, but in certain spots it would kind of jet out from the bank, or it would be like tucked in or just clumped up in certain areas. Those are the ambush areas that you're gonna wanna throw your frog, okay? So you're gonna wanna look for those points that kind of come out of grass. You're gonna wanna look for those like spots where the bank kind of goes in and there's duckweed or there's grass pushed into those areas. Or there's just like, it happens to be that duckweed's just piling in a certain spot, like the slough is bringing weeds and duckweed down through and it's just getting hung up and piled there. Those are great ambush points for fish. That's definitely gonna be spots that you're gonna wanna throw that frog into. You're gonna wanna get it into those ambush points. That's gonna give you your highest percentage for getting a bite off of the frog. Now when I'm fishing lily pads, what I'm looking for with lily pads is kind of isolated clumps of lily pads that have good openings for ambush points. So you'll see like a patch of lily pads, and in that patch of lily pads will be like an opening of water where there is no lily pads. Those are gonna be the ambush points. Those are gonna be the points where you're gonna wanna toss a frog, and when you get it to that spot, you're gonna wanna let it sit, like pop it and let it sit in that area, because that's gonna be the high percentage ambush point in that specific spot. So now let's get into how to fish a frog. Now, one of the ways that I always express to beginners on how to fish a frog is fishing it with your rod tip high. And what I mean by that is I have a rod here and I can kind of show you guys here. Is a lot of guys, you'll see pros, they'll have their rod tip down and they'll be working the frog down low. For beginners, and I still do this to this day, depending on some of the cover that I'm fishing, is I always say keep your rod tip high when you're fishing a frog. Reel it and pop it with your rod tip nice and high. And what that's gonna do, especially if you're a beginner frog fisherman, the bass is gonna come up to eat that frog. And when he comes out of the water, he's not gonna have it right away. Sometimes bass will come out of the water, they'll grab the frog, but what they'll do is they'll come out and they'll grab and they'll get the legs, right? And as the bass goes down in the water, they've only got the legs yet. They haven't worked the whole frog into their mouth. And if you're working your rod tip down low, to set the hook, you just gotta come up, right? So when you're holding your rod tip high, working that frog, you gotta reel down and set the hook. So if a bass does come up and grab the frog right at the back and drag it down, the time it takes you to reel down and come up might be just enough time for him to grab it. And the reason I say that is because beginners tend to not be disciplined on waiting on the hook set, okay? I still fall victim to this, still to this day. You get excited when a frog bite's going. You just can't help it. You get excited and you just set right away, you know, and then you end up reefing that right out of his mouth. So what you want to do is work your rod tip high. They'll come out of the water, they'll grab it, and by the time you reel down and set, they should have the frog all the way. Now, if you're gonna work the frog with your rod tip down low, like how I like to do it, I cast it out there, I keep my rod tip low, and I work the frog. Up the slack a little bit, feel them, like tug your rod down and then set, okay? Lots of times what I like to do, a good rule, is throw it out there. If a bass comes up and eats the frog, I like to count in my head 1 1,000, 2 1,000, set. That's gonna give you enough time to let that fish take the frog down and get it in his mouth. So he comes up, hits, It goes down, 1,000, 2, 1,000, reel down, you know, and set the hook. A lot of times, like I said, you got your rod tip low, you're gonna go and pull right away, set the hook, you're gonna reef it right out of his mouth. Another great, excellent tip for fishing a frog, guys, is sometimes frogs, like these Spro frogs, can get pretty heavy. And you don't want to spook the fish when you cast them in there. Sometimes you're trying to do big bombs of casts, so you gun it way out there and it slaps the water and then it just makes a bunch of commotion. A great natural presentation to do with these frogs is get closer to the bank, throw it onto the bank actually. I like to throw my frog into the weeds or onto the bank and then just kind of pop it off of the bank or off of the reeds into the water. And what that'll do is the frog will come off of the bank into the water. And sometimes those fish are sitting so tight to the bank that right as you get it into the water on the bank, they'll actually come and hit it. It looks really natural with that frog coming off of the bank into the water. You're not spooking fish, and it's a more natural presentation to them. So how do I work a frog? Once I cast it out there and I'm working a frog, basically guys, one of my things is I just like walking the dog. Just walking the frog back to me. Sometimes I'll mix up the cadence. You really gotta play with it and see what the fish wants. Most of the time when I work a frog, I'm working it pretty fast. I'm not gonna lie. I'm gonna just keep popping my rod tip, you know, reeling up, and I'm just gonna keep going. I like to fish a frog pretty fast, especially on the Mississippi River, guys. When you're fishing a frog, it's almost like a search bait. Sometimes you're just trying to find fish. Most of the time when a bass bites a frog, they'll bite it again. As long as you didn't get hooks on them, they will bite it again. So if you're working a frog pretty quick and all of a sudden, bam, you get blown up, you can pull your frog out of there, you can throw it back in there, slow it down, and then get them to really eat it. That's a prime example of what we did on the Mississippi River, guys. Last weekend when I was out with Angler X, I can't tell you how many blow-ups we had with working the frog super fast. Had a blow up, had a roll on the frog, throw back in there, slow that presentation of the frog down, and bam, get blown up, and they really eat it, get a good hook set in them, and get them in the boat. So you really gotta play with the cadence, guys. I work a frog pretty fast, like I said. Sometimes what you can do is do like 1, 2, stop, 1, 2, stop, or I've seen my father-in-law do it. He likes to give it a big, especially with a popping frog, he likes to give a big splash and then let it sit. Big splash and let it sit. Almost like you're working like a topwater popper, just boom, let it sit. Let it sit for like 3 to 5 seconds, boom, let it sit. You know, sometimes that gets the fish to strike. So you really gotta play with the cadence, but most of the time I think working it, you know, fast or medium is a good way to start. Another great tip for you guys when working a frog is to have a punching setup nearby. So what I mean by that, guys, is when I'm working a frog, sometimes a bass will bite the frog, they'll miss it, right? You'll throw back in there, they'll miss it again. You'll throw back in, they just don't hit it that time. It's a great idea to have a punching rig on hand. And what I mean by that is I use it for a follow-up bait, okay? So what you can do is if they're not eating the frog, like they bit at it and then all of a sudden they stop, what you can do with that punching rig is flip in there. Sometimes flipping in that slower presentation will get that fish to bite on that follow-up bite rather than the frog. So lastly, guys, the setup that we use to frog. Now, I know in a lot of videos I talk about the setups in every single one, but I can't not go over the setup for frogging, guys. So what you're gonna wanna use, and I don't care what rod you use, whatever it is, I would suggest going with a heavy action rod. I have fished a frog off of a medium heavy rod. It works fine. I've honestly never had issues on a medium heavy, but when you get into that really thick stuff, I tend to use a heavy action rod. It's a lot thicker stuff. You really want that backbone, especially with the frog. It's got pretty big hooks on it, so you want to be able to drive those hooks home. But this is the ALX ICOS Hammer 7.3, absolute beast of a frogging rod, super, super light. But you want to use a heavy rod. 65-pound braid is what I have on here, 60 or 65. I would say go 50. 50 is probably a great line for frogging. You can get more line on your reel with 50 pound than you can 60 or 65. you can get more line on there and it's pretty strong. So 50 to 65 pound braid I think is plenty. Your reel is gonna be really important. I think that you're gonna want a really high speed reel, because when a fish hits, you wanna be able to set the hook and get them out of those weeds as fast as possible, because if that fish drags you down into those weeds, it's more chance for him to get off of the hooks, and it's a lot tougher on you to reef them out of there. So I go with the Revo SX. It's a 7-3-1 Abu Garcia reel, super fast reel, but I would say 7-3-1 or even an 8-1-1, as fast as you can get, is what you're gonna wanna put on your frogging setup. That pretty much wraps up the setup, guys. I think it's really important to go over that. I know I've said it in other videos, but we're talking about frogging, so we gotta talk about a setup. All right, guys, so that pretty much wraps up the video here. Like I said, we were talking about frogging today. I've got tons of frogs here. I've been getting a lot of questions about fishing a frog as well. A lot of beginner questions, you know, how do you do this? How do you do that? What is the best thing to use for this? What colored frogs do you buy? Really, guys, if I could hit any of the key points out of today, it doesn't matter too much. I would stick to a black frog or a white frog. Color does not matter. The second key point, look for ambush points, guys. Sometimes you get into an area where it's just pure grass and mats and stuff like that. It's really hard to depict those areas. So I like to look, you know, for an area that's gonna have good ambush points, you know, jetting out and whatnot. Those are really gonna hold a lot of good fish. And the last key point that I would say out of all the tips that I've said is give that fish time to get the frog in its mouth, okay? Like I said, work your rod tip high. That'll give you time to reel down and set the hook, or just count 1,000, 2,000 in your head. Let that fish get that frog down in its mouth. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you have any tips or questions or anything, drop them down in the comments below. I will do my best to answer any questions you guys have if I did not mention them in this video, or if you have some great frogging tips that you know of that I did not mention, throw it in the comments below as well. Like I said, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Remember to like and subscribe, and until next time, keep fishing hard.